Number 1. Terry Nichols. Terry Nichols' sentencing in 2004 was the final legal blow in a case that had defined American domestic terrorism for nearly a decade. But to understand why the punishment was so severe, you have to understand the role Nichols actually played. He wasn't the one who drove the Ryder truck filled with explosives to the Murrah Federal Building, and he wasn't the one who pressed the trigger that killed 168 people, including children in the building's daycare center. But the mountain of evidence presented across two major trials showed that Nichols was far more than a passive supporter. Prosecutors demonstrated how Nichols helped Timothy McVeigh every step of the way, gathering ammonium nitrate fertilizer, assisting with the construction of the bomb components, providing money McVeigh needed to purchase supplies, storing stolen materials, and even helping create the cover stories that allowed McVeigh to move without drawing attention. Their relationship stretched back to the Army, where both men expressed resentment toward the federal government, a resentment that intensified through the early 1990s. Nichols withdrew from normal life, drifting between odd jobs, living on isolated properties, and immersing himself in anti-government ideology. That isolation made him the perfect partner for McVeigh, who relied on Nichols for logistics, materials, and a secure base of operations. After the bombing in 1995, investigators quickly uncovered evidence linking Nichols to the conspiracy, including receipts, witness testimony, and materials found in storage lockers he controlled. His first federal trial in 1997 resulted in a life sentence rather than death, a decision that outraged many of the victims' families. The sense of unfinished justice lingered for years, and Oklahoma officials pushed for their own state-level prosecution to ensure Nichols would not escape with just a single sentence for a crime of this magnitude. By the time Nichols entered the Oklahoma courthouse in 2004, the public already understood the scale of devastation he helped create, but the sentencing hearing was where everything became final. On May 26, 2004, the judge delivered one of the harshest punishments in American history: 161 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, one for every life lost in the bombing. The courtroom was silent except for the judge's voice, and Nichols stood motionless, offering no apology, no emotion, and no acknowledgement of the families present. For survivors and relatives of the victims, the sentence was more than symbolic. It was closure. With McVeigh executed in 2001 and Nichols now condemned to die behind bars, the two men responsible for the deadliest domestic attack in U.S. history were permanently removed from society. The sentencing also clarified an important legal principle. Participation in terrorism doesn't require pressing the detonator. If someone builds, finances, stores, transports, or materially enables an act of mass violence, the law treats them as fully responsible for the outcome. Nichols' actions had been integral to assembling the bomb, and prosecutors argued that without his support, McVeigh's plan would never have reached operational capability. After sentencing, Nichols was transferred to ADX Florence, the federal supermax prison in Colorado, known as the most secure penitentiary in the country. There, inmates spend up to 23 hours a day in isolated cells with limited human contact, a far cry from the life Nichols once had, but one that reflected the gravity of his crimes. He remains there today, largely silent, rarely seen, and almost entirely disconnected from the outside world. His case serves as a reminder that acts of terror rely on more than one trigger pull. They depend on planners, facilitators, and collaborators whose behind-the-scenes work makes mass tragedy possible. The 2004 sentence ensured that Nichols would never again walk free, closing one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history and affirming that responsibility for a crime of this scale extends to every person who helped make it happen. 2. John Allen Muhammad. John Allen Muhammad's 2004 sentencing was the culmination of one of the most terrifying crime sprees in modern American history, a 3-week period in October 2002 when the Washington, D.C. region lived in fear of an unseen killer who shot victims at random, without warning and without any apparent pattern. Muhammad, later known as the D.C. Sniper, orchestrated one of the most psychologically effective terror campaigns the country had ever seen, creating a climate where ordinary activities like pumping gas, walking across a parking lot, or loading groceries became moments of panic. The prosecution painted Muhammad as the mastermind, the strategist, and the controlling force behind the attacks, with his teenage accomplice Lee Boyd Malvo acting as the triggerman in many of the shootings. Investigators revealed how Muhammad modified a blue 1990 Chevy Caprice into a mobile sniper platform, cutting a hole near the license plate so the rifle muzzle could extend outward while the shooter remained concealed inside the trunk. This setup allowed the pair to fire from almost anywhere without being seen. During the spree, 10 people were killed and 3 were critically wounded, each shot from long range with precision, often in broad daylight. The randomness of the locations and victims made the attacks feel unstoppable, and law enforcement agencies across multiple jurisdictions struggled to piece together a motive or identify the shooters. When Muhammad was finally arrested, the evidence found in the vehicle and in his possession removed all doubt about his role. Prosecutors argued that Muhammad's motive blended personal resentment, financial desperation, and a delusional belief that these killings would destabilize society enough to allow him to reclaim custody of his children. The trial in Virginia, which began in 2003, focused on the murder of Dean Myers, one of the victims slain at a gas station. The state aggressively pursued the death penalty, arguing that Muhammad acted as the architect of a coordinated reign of terror that traumatized millions of residents across the D.C. corridor. On March 9, 2004, the court delivered its final decision, a sentence of death, concluding that Muhammad's actions met every legal standard for capital punishment: premeditation, multiple victims, extreme risk to the public, and unparalleled psychological harm to an entire region. Muhammad listened to the sentence without visible emotion, maintaining the same cold, detached demeanor he showed throughout the trial. For the victims' families, the sentencing represented long-awaited closure after months of fear, grief, and confusion. Muhammad's sentence underscored a crucial legal principle. Even if he didn't fire every shot, his orchestration, planning, and exploitation of a minor to carry out the killings made him equally responsible for every life lost. The lethal injection, carried out in 2009, ended the legal saga, but not the broader conversation around how 2 individuals were able to paralyze a major metropolitan area using a single rifle and a car rigged for concealment. Today, the D.C. sniper case remains a disturbing example of how terror can be manufactured not with large-scale explosives or political agendas, but with calculation, mobility, and psychological manipulation. Muhammad's legacy is not just the number of victims, but the way he weaponized fear itself, turning daily routines into life-or-death gambles and forcing an entire region to live under the shadow of a rifle barrel they never saw. 3. Patrick Kennedy. Patrick Kennedy's 2004 case became one of the most controversial criminal sentences of the decade, not just for the brutality of the crime itself, but for the legal battle that followed, ultimately forcing the United States Supreme Court to reconsider the limits of the death penalty. Kennedy, a stepfather from Louisiana, was convicted of the aggravated rape of his 8-year-old stepdaughter, a crime so violent that investigators initially believed the child would not survive her injuries. The attack was described as one of the most severe child assault cases the state had ever prosecuted, leaving the community horrified and law enforcement determined to secure the harshest penalty available. When the case went to trial, prosecutors portrayed Kennedy as manipulative and unremorseful, a man who not only committed a horrific act, but then attempted to hide it by staging the scene and concocting a false account of intruders attacking the girl. The jury quickly found him guilty, and in 2004, the judge imposed the death penalty, making Kennedy the first person in Louisiana, and one of the very few in modern U.S. history, to be sentenced to death for a crime in which the victim survived. The sentence was unusual because existing death penalty precedent in the United States had primarily focused on murders, terrorism, and extreme forms of felony homicide. Kennedy's case pushed into legally untested territory. Could the government execute someone for a non-homicide crime, even one as horrific as child rape? Louisiana argued that the trauma, physical destruction, and lifelong damage inflicted on the victim justified the ultimate punishment. The verdict reignited nationwide debate over proportional justice, retribution, deterrence, and the role of capital punishment in crimes involving children. Kennedy remained on death row, while the case triggered appeals that climbed all the way to the Supreme Court. Defense attorneys argued that imposing the death penalty for a crime where the victim lived violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. They claimed that allowing executions for non-homicide crimes would open the door to broader and more inconsistent applications of the death penalty, a path the federal government had deliberately avoided since the 1970s. In 2008, 4 years after Kennedy's original sentence, the Supreme Court handed down a landmark decision. In a 5-4 ruling, the court overturned Kennedy's death sentence, stating that capital punishment could not be applied to cases of child rape where the victim did not die. The justices argued that while the crime was monstrous, the death penalty must be reserved for offenses in which the perpetrator's actions intentionally or directly resulted in loss of life. The ruling immediately invalidated Kennedy's sentence and set national precedent across all states. It also sparked intense backlash in Louisiana and other parts of the country, where many believed the decision removed a crucial tool for punishing the most extreme child predators. The victim's family expressed frustration that the man responsible for such catastrophic harm would no longer face execution. Kennedy himself remained in prison, serving a life sentence without parole, but the Supreme Court ruling permanently reshaped the boundaries of capital punishment in America. It forced prosecutors to rethink strategies in non-homicide cases, blocked future death sentences for similar crimes, and cemented Patrick Kennedy's name in legal history, not for the assault itself, but for the constitutional battle it triggered. Today, his case remains one of the most cited examples in debates about the scope of the death penalty, used by scholars, lawmakers, and courts to illustrate where the line is drawn between the harshest criminal penalties and constitutional protections. The 2004 sentencing, though later overturned, still stands as a moment when public outrage, legal philosophy, and moral questions collided, challenging the justice system to define how far it can go in punishing those who commit the most devastating violations against children. 4. Martha Stewart. Martha Stewart's 2004 sentencing became one of the most widely publicized white-collar crime cases in American history, not because it involved massive financial fraud like Enron or WorldCom, but because it brought down a woman who had built an empire on trust, refinement, and the image of flawless personal judgment. Stewart wasn't just a television host or cookbook writer. She was a multi-millionaire CEO whose brand was built on the idea that she knew better than anyone how things should be done. So when federal investigators accused her of lying about a stock sale connected to insider information, the public reaction mixed disbelief with a kind of morbid fascination. The case revolved around her December 2001 sale of Imclone Systems stock, which she dumped a day before the price collapsed after regulators rejected one of the company's key drug applications. Prosecutors argued that Stewart sold her shares because she had been tipped off that the company's CEO, Samuel Waxall, was liquidating his own holdings ahead of the announcement. Stewart insisted the sale was part of a pre-existing agreement with her broker, but phone records, testimony, and inconsistencies in her story led investigators to believe she was covering up the real reason she acted when she did. Importantly, she was not charged with insider trading itself. The government couldn't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that she knowingly traded on confidential information. Instead, what destroyed her was the cover-up: obstruction of justice, lying to federal agents, and making false statements that undermined the investigation. During the trial, prosecutors emphasized that Stewart was not being targeted because she was famous, but because she had used her reputation and influence to push a false narrative, encouraging others to say she had a standing agreement to sell the stock at a certain price, an agreement the evidence showed didn't exist. For jurors, the turning point was the paper trail and the shifting explanations Stewart gave as scrutiny increased. On March 5, 2004, she was convicted on 4 felony counts. The media frenzy was immediate. News outlets covered her every move, speculating on whether she would be given special treatment due to her fame, whether she would serve time in a low-security facility, and how her company, Martha Stewart Living Omni Media, would survive the blow. Her sentencing on July 16, 2004, became a cultural moment. The judge imposed 5 months in federal prison, 5 months of house arrest, 2 years of probation, and a $30,000 fine. While some believed the sentence was harsh for a nonviolent offender whose financial gain was relatively small, others argued that making an example of a powerful public figure reinforced that lying to federal investigators carries real consequences. Stewart, in a surprising display of stoicism, accepted the sentence without attempting to leverage her fame for leniency. She requested to begin her prison term immediately rather than drag the process through more appeals, a strategic move that ultimately helped rehabilitate her image. Her incarceration at Alderson Federal Prison Camp, nicknamed Camp Cupcake, became the subject of endless media gossip, but the reality was straightforward. Stewart followed the rules, kept a low profile, and served her time without incident. The aftermath proved just as significant as the conviction. Instead of fading, Stewart returned to the public eye with renewed intensity, turning her prison experience into a narrative of resilience and reinvention. Her company regained stability, her television presence returned, and she even expanded into new ventures. But from a legal standpoint, the case remains important because it illustrates a recurring truth in white-collar crime. The lie often becomes more damaging than the act itself. Stewart's downfall wasn't caused by the amount of money she saved by selling the stock. It was caused by her attempt to hide the real reason behind the sale, believing she could outmaneuver federal investigators. The 2004 sentencing also reinforced that celebrity status does not shield defendants from accountability in federal courtrooms. While critics still debate whether the charges were excessive or politically motivated, the conviction stands as a warning to anyone who deals with insider information, securities regulations, or federal inquiries. Martha Stewart's story is unusual because it blends corporate misconduct with pop culture spectacle, transforming a routine securities case into a national drama about image, integrity, and the consequences of deception. Her sentencing became a defining moment not only in her career, but in the public's understanding of how quickly reputations can collapse when personal decisions collide with federal law. 5. Scott Peterson. Scott Peterson's 2004 sentencing became one of the most polarizing and emotionally charged moments in modern American criminal history, transforming a once ordinary husband from Modesto, California, into one of the most infamous figures of the decade. The case began in late December 2002, when his pregnant wife, Laci Peterson, vanished just weeks before she was due to give birth to their son, Connor. At first, Scott presented himself as a worried, grieving husband, giving interviews, cooperating publicly with police, and appearing visibly involved in the search. But that public image collapsed quickly as investigators uncovered a series of lies, contradictions, and disturbing details that pointed directly to him. The strongest blow to his credibility came when the world learned he had been having an affair with a woman named Amber Frey, who believed Scott was a single man until he told her, just weeks before Laci disappeared, that his wife was dead. When Frey came forward, cooperating with law enforcement and recording conversations with Scott, public opinion shifted dramatically. As search teams worked along the Berkeley shoreline, where Scott claimed he had gone fishing on the very day Laci vanished, suspicion focused entirely on him. In April 2003, when the remains of Laci and unborn Connor washed ashore near the same area, the circumstantial case became a tightly woven narrative of deceit, motive, and opportunity. Prosecutors argued that Peterson, unhappy in his marriage and eager to pursue a different life free of responsibility, killed Laci at their home on Christmas Eve, transported her body in his truck, and dumped her into San Francisco Bay during what he claimed was a casual fishing trip. The defense countered that the case lacked forensic evidence, had no eyewitnesses, and relied heavily on assumptions about Scott's behavior. But the prosecution's theory, combined with Scott's lies, his calm demeanor, and his attempt to sell Laci's car, his plans to rent out their home, and the discovery that he had dyed his hair and carried thousands of dollars in cash when arrested, convinced the jury that he was preparing for a life on the run. The trial became a media spectacle, with daily broadcasts, crowds outside the courthouse, and non-stop debate about Scott's guilt. On November 12, 2004, the jury found him guilty of first-degree murder for Laci's death and second-degree murder for Connor's. The penalty phase intensified the emotional weight in the courtroom, as Laci's family delivered heartbreaking victim impact statements describing the devastation Scott had caused. The prosecution argued for the death penalty, framing the murders as calculated, heartless acts meant to eliminate Scott's obligations and preserve his personal freedom. On December 13, 2004, the jury recommended death, a decision the judge affirmed months later. Scott Peterson was formally sentenced to death by lethal injection and sent to San Quentin State Prison, where he would remain on death row for nearly 2 decades. The sentencing brought a sense of closure for Laci's family, but also fueled ongoing national debate about whether Peterson truly received a fair trial. Critics argued that media saturation, juror misconduct concerns, and reliance on circumstantial evidence created a flawed conviction. Supporters of the verdict countered that Peterson's pattern of behavior, lies, and attempts to evade responsibility formed an overwhelmingly clear picture. In 2020, the California Supreme Court overturned Peterson's death sentence due to issues with jury selection, but upheld his murder convictions, reaffirming the conclusion that he was responsible for both deaths. The case continues to divide public opinion, but the 2004 sentencing remains a defining cultural moment, symbolizing how a seemingly average suburban life can conceal extraordinary deception. Scott Peterson's transformation, from husband and father-to-be to death row inmate, became one of the most dramatic criminal narratives of the early 2000s, and it remains one of the most discussed murder cases of the modern era, illustrating how motive, lies, and emotional manipulation can unravel a family and shock a nation. 6. Martin L. Grass. Martin L. Grass's 2004 sentencing marked the downfall of a corporate empire that had once been considered one of the most trusted names in American retail pharmacy. As the CEO of Rite Aid, Grass was at the center of a massive accounting fraud that ultimately unraveled the company's financial stability, wiped out billions in shareholder value, and exposed how corporate greed at the highest levels can cripple a major national chain. Grass, the son of Rite Aid founder Alex Grass, had risen quickly through the ranks, taking over leadership in the 1990s as the company pursued rapid expansion. Under his command, Rite Aid grew aggressively, acquiring competitors and expanding its footprint across the country. But behind that aggressive growth strategy, prosecutors later showed, the company's financial reporting was increasingly disconnected from reality. Investigators revealed that Grass and several top executives engaged in systematic manipulation of earnings reports, inflating profits by hundreds of millions of dollars to maintain the illusion of strong performance. They altered accounting records, hid operational losses, and misled auditors to make Rite Aid appear far more profitable than it actually was. The motive was simple: protect stock prices, safeguard executive bonuses, and maintain an image of stability that would keep investors confident. When the fraud finally came to light in 1999, Rite Aid's stock collapsed. Auditors discovered enormous discrepancies, and the company was forced to restate earnings by nearly $1.6 billion. One of the largest corporate restatements in U.S. history at the time. The scandal triggered a wave of lawsuits, corporate restructuring, and executive resignations. Grass resigned under pressure, but insisted publicly that he had done nothing wrong. Federal investigators saw it differently. A multi-year investigation uncovered evidence that Grass had knowingly approved inflated numbers, signed off on fraudulent financial statements, and taken part in efforts to obstruct auditors who questioned the inconsistencies. In 2003, he was indicted on charges including conspiracy, falsifying financial disclosures, filing false statements, and obstructing justice. The trial centered on the argument that Grass had betrayed shareholders, employees, and the public by manipulating financial data to maintain control of a company that was increasingly unstable behind the scenes. Prosecutors highlighted internal emails, accounting records, and witness testimony from executives who had turned cooperating witnesses. They described Grass not as a passive CEO who failed to catch errors, but as an active participant in the scheme who pressured subordinates to produce numbers that matched the narrative he wanted investors to see. By the time he entered the courtroom for sentencing in 2004, Rite Aid had already rebuilt much of its leadership structure, but the damage to its reputation remained. For many Americans, the case symbolized the growing distrust in corporate accountability following a series of early 2000s scandals. When the judge sentenced Grass to 8 years in federal prison, it signaled that white-collar crime, especially at the executive level, would no longer be treated as a consequence-free offense. Grass was also ordered to pay millions in restitution and fines. The courtroom reaction underscored the gravity of the betrayal. Investors had lost fortunes, retirement accounts had been gutted, and thousands of employees saw their company's future jeopardized because leadership chose deception over transparency. Unlike many violent criminals whose actions harm individuals, Grass's decisions rippled across the entire company and into the homes of ordinary families who had trusted Rite Aid as an employer and investment. After beginning his sentence, Grass maintained limited public visibility, issuing occasional statements but largely retreating from the corporate world. His fall from CEO to federal inmate became a case study in business schools and regulatory circles, illustrating how weak oversight, unchecked authority, and the pursuit of rapid profit create an environment where fraud can flourish. The 2004 sentencing remains a turning point in the push for stricter corporate governance reforms, including stronger auditing requirements and accountability measures for CEOs who sign financial statements. Grass's story serves as a reminder that white-collar crimes can be just as devastating as violent offenses, destroying livelihoods, destabilizing corporations, and eroding public trust in economic systems. His downfall is a lesson in the cost of manipulating reality to preserve power, and how even the most influential executives can face serious consequences when their deception becomes too massive to hide. 7. Franklin C. Brown. Franklin C. Brown's 2004 sentencing became one of the most striking examples of how devastating white-collar crime can be when the very people tasked with upholding the law become active participants in breaking it. As Rite Aid's former chief counsel, Brown was not just another executive caught in the fallout of a corporate scandal. He was the company's top legal authority, a man whose professional responsibility was to prevent exactly the kind of fraud he ultimately helped perpetrate. His downfall showed how corruption at the top can rot an entire organization from within. Brown's involvement in the Rite Aid accounting scandal emerged from a culture obsessed with financial performance during the late 1990s, when Wall Street rewarded rapid growth and punished even minor downturns. Under CEO Martin L. Grass, the company expanded aggressively, swallowing competitors and rapidly increasing its national footprint. But behind the scenes, auditors and internal analysts began noticing that the company's earnings reports didn't align with operational reality. Losses were mounting, expenses were rising, and the rapid expansion was becoming unsustainable without honest reporting and strategic restructuring. Instead of confronting the truth, executives chose deception. Prosecutors later demonstrated that Grass and several top officers pressured employees to inflate earnings, hide expenses, and manipulate accounting figures to keep the stock price from collapsing. In theory, the chief legal counsel should have been the one to intervene, to force compliance, and to stop the fraud before it grew into a multi-billion-dollar disaster. But Brown, according to prosecutors, did the opposite. Evidence presented in court showed that Brown used his legal knowledge to help craft misleading disclosures, approve inaccurate statements, and shield the fraudulent numbers from external scrutiny. He signed off on documents that misrepresented the company's finances, supported the use of improper accounting entries, and played a pivotal role in obstructing auditors who questioned inconsistencies. Witnesses testified that Brown, rather than acting as a gatekeeper, became a facilitator of wrongdoing, providing legal cover for decisions that he knew misled investors and regulators. His legal expertise made the fraud harder to detect because auditors expected honesty from the company's top attorney. By 1999, when the fraud finally surfaced, the damage was immense. Rite Aid restated its earnings by over $1.6 billion, at the time one of the largest restatements in U.S. history. Investors saw their portfolios crushed. Employees lost faith in company leadership, and public trust evaporated. The scandal triggered investigations, lawsuits, leadership shakeups, and forced the company into a long period of rebuilding. When the federal investigation into Brown intensified, he maintained his innocence, claiming he had relied on financial information provided by others and was himself misled. But the evidence contradicted that narrative. Emails, memos, internal notes, and testimony from cooperating executives revealed that Brown actively participated in efforts to hide the truth. Prosecutors argued that his intimate knowledge of securities law made his actions more egregious. He knew the legal implications, understood the duty of transparency, and still approved deceptive practices. The prosecution built the case that Brown's betrayal was not a passive failure, but a conscious decision to prioritize company optics and executive interests over the law. During the trial, victims spoke about the consequences of the scandal. Many had invested heavily in Rite Aid stock, believing it was stable, only to see their retirement portfolios devastated. Employees described how the scandal cost them promotions, job security, and trust in the company they had dedicated their careers to. The courtroom atmosphere was charged with frustration, not the emotional fury that accompanies violent crime sentencing, but a deep, simmering anger at the sense of betrayal and the long-term financial damage inflicted by corporate deceit. When the judge handed down the sentence in October 2004, 10 years in federal prison, it sent a shockwave through the legal community. It was extremely rare for a corporate lawyer to receive such a severe punishment. Judges typically reserved long sentences for CEOs or CFOs who directly manipulated financial statements. But Brown's punishment reflected the court's belief that legal professionals carry an even higher responsibility. The judge emphasized that when attorneys are complicit in fraud, they undermine the entire regulatory system and enable crimes that harm thousands of people. Brown's sentence became a landmark moment in corporate governance history, signaling that legal counsel are not shielded by their role and that their participation in fraud is as serious as any executives. After entering prison, Brown largely disappeared from public discussion, his decades-long legal career destroyed. He became a cautionary example in law schools, where his case is used to teach future attorneys about ethical responsibility and the catastrophic consequences of violating it. The Rite Aid scandal and Brown's imprisonment helped fuel broader reforms, including stricter oversight of internal legal departments, more aggressive enforcement of securities laws, and increased accountability for corporate attorneys who sign off on financial disclosures. It contributed to the national shift toward harsher penalties for white-collar criminals following the Enron, Tyco, and WorldCom collapses. Brown's story remains a chilling reminder that financial crimes are not victimless. They can wreck retirement accounts, destabilize companies, and erode public trust just as profoundly as physical crimes harm individuals. His downfall illustrates how power and responsibility can be corrupted when those entrusted with the law choose loyalty to executives over loyalty to truth. In the end, Franklin C. Brown's 2004 sentencing stands as one of the clearest warnings in corporate America. When the guardians of legality abandon their duty, the consequences ripple far wider than any single courtroom can measure. 8. Robert V. Gale. Robert V. Gale's 2004 sentencing unfolded in the shadow of one of the most devastating institutional scandals in modern American history, the Catholic Church abuse crisis, a scandal that shook communities, exposed systemic cover-ups, and forced the public to confront how deeply trauma can spread when trusted authority figures exploit the vulnerable. Gale, a Boston area priest, became one of the many clergy members whose crimes came to light during the early 2000s as victims across the United States, inspired and supported by investigative journalism and growing national outrage, finally felt safe enough to speak about experiences that had been buried for decades. His case was not just about one offender. It was about the indictment of an entire system that had allowed abusers to operate unchecked. By the time Gale entered the courtroom in December 2004, the Mother Church in Boston had already been rocked by lawsuits, resignations, and the resignation of Cardinal Bernard Law, accused of transferring priests with known histories of abuse rather than removing them. Gale's case stood out because it captured the full scale of betrayal. A priest who used his spiritual authority not to guide or comfort, but to manipulate and violate children who trusted him. Prosecutors detailed how Gale assaulted a young boy during the 1980s, beginning when the child was just 12 years old. The abuse continued for years, during which Gale used intimidation, secrecy, and the weight of religion to maintain control. This was not a single incident, but a pattern of grooming, coercion, and psychological manipulation, a pattern mirrored across hundreds of documented cases nationwide. The victim, now an adult, testified to the long-lasting effects the abuse had on his relationships, mental health, and ability to trust others. When he described how Gale twisted religious teachings to justify or conceal the acts, the courtroom felt the full emotional impact of what it means for a child to be harmed by someone presented as a representative of God. What made Gale's prosecution particularly significant was the timeline. Many clergy abuse cases had occurred decades earlier and were difficult to prosecute due to statutes of limitations or lack of physical evidence. But in Gale's situation, prosecutors were able to bring a viable case that avoided those barriers. The evidence, though relying heavily on testimony, aligned with a larger pattern documented across parishes, patterns the archdiocese had failed to act upon for years. During the trial, Gale's defense attempted what many clergy defendants had tried, to undermine the victim's memory by suggesting inconsistencies, to point to the time gap, and to argue that no physical evidence remained to verify decades-old claims. But jurors had already been exposed to years of reporting that revealed how widespread and consistent these patterns were. The defense strategy felt dated, almost tone-deaf to the cultural shift that had occurred. People were no longer willing to accept claims that victims misremembered or exaggerated. They had heard too many similar accounts to believe they were coincidences. Gale's demeanor during the trial fueled public anger. Some expected remorse or acknowledgement, but instead he maintained a rigid, defensive posture, refusing to admit wrongdoing. In December 2004, when the judge sentenced him to 4.5 to 5 years in prison, reactions were mixed. Some felt relieved that he was finally held accountable. Others believed the sentence was far too lenient for a man who had stolen a child's innocence and inflicted lifelong damage. But the sentence reflected the limitations of the charges available at the time. Even so, the symbolic weight was immense. A priest was going to prison not because the church quietly reassigned him, but because civil authorities finally stepped in when the church would not. Gale's conviction echoed through the Catholic community. It represented a growing shift from institutional self-protection toward public accountability. Victims' advocacy groups argued that while one priest's punishment could not repair the systemic failures that allowed abuse to flourish, it sent a message that the era of silence was ending. The Boston Archdiocese, facing massive financial settlements and public distrust, began implementing reforms, though critics said they came too late for the countless victims whose lives had already been shaped by trauma. Gale entered prison as a symbol of that era of reckoning. His life after incarceration remained largely out of public view, though restrictions placed on him reflected an understanding of the threat he posed. What stood out historically was not just his individual crime, but the context in which it occurred. A time when the public finally understood that abuse was not the product of a few isolated offenders, but part of a systemic failure at the highest levels of church leadership. Gale's sentencing contributed to broader changes in how institutions handle allegations of abuse. Schools, churches, youth programs, and other organizations began implementing background checks, mandatory reporting laws strengthened, and public trust shifted from institutions to independent investigations. Gale's case demonstrated that accountability is not optional, and that even revered institutions must face scrutiny when they fail to protect children. More importantly, it served as a reminder of the staggering damage caused when predators are shielded by their titles. The pain inflicted by clergy abuse does not fade with time. It imprints itself on every stage of a victim's life, shaping relationships, beliefs, and mental health. Gale's imprisonment, although brief compared to the lifetime effects on his victim, signified a turning point in the national conversation about justice, power, and responsibility. It showed that religious authority cannot excuse criminal behavior and that no institution is above the law. Robert V. Gale will forever be remembered not for sermons or charity work, but for violating the very principles he was entrusted to uphold, and for becoming one more example of how unchecked authority can lead to catastrophic harm when systems designed to protect the vulnerable fail to do so. 9. Lee Boyd Malvo. Lee Boyd Malvo's 2004 sentencing stands as one of the most complex and emotionally charged moments in the aftermath of the Washington, D.C. sniper attacks, a crime spree that paralyzed an entire region and left the country grappling with questions about terrorism, manipulation, youth culpability, and justice. Malvo was only 17 years old when he and 41-year-old John Allen Muhammad carried out a coordinated series of shootings in October 2002, striking at random locations across Maryland, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. The attacks were executed with chilling precision. Victims were shot while pumping gas, loading groceries, walking across parking lots, or simply going about their daily routines. The randomness created a wave of public fear, rare in modern American crime, because no one felt safe. Not parents, not workers, not students, not senior citizens. Anyone, anywhere, at any moment could be the next target. In the center of this storm stood Malvo, a teenager whose transformation from a homeless adolescent into an accomplice in one of the most terrifying crime waves in American history remains a disturbing example of how vulnerable young people can be radicalized by predatory adults. To understand why Malvo's 2004 sentencing had such cultural impact, it's important to understand his relationship with Muhammad. Malvo grew up in a fractured, unstable environment in Jamaica and later Antigua, marked by poverty, isolation, and inconsistent adult presence. When he met Muhammad, the older man quickly became a father figure, providing attention, structure, and ideological influence that Malvo had lacked. Prosecutors and psychologists described how Muhammad exerted psychological control over the teenager, shaping him through a mix of affection, discipline, indoctrination, and emotional dependency. The pair lived a nomadic life throughout the United States, often sleeping in cars or tents, as Muhammad fed Malvo a narrative that positioned the boy as part of a mission to strike back at a society Muhammad believed had wronged him. That manipulation culminated in the creation of the blue Chevy Caprice sniper platform, a car modified to allow shots to be fired from the trunk through a small, nearly invisible opening. This tactical setup made the shooters nearly impossible to detect, allowing them to attack without witnesses and disappear within seconds. During the 3-week spree, Malvo and Muhammad killed 10 people and critically injured 3 others, choosing victims with no apparent pattern except vulnerability and opportunity. It was a form of terrorism built on psychological warfare, turning mundane activities into moments of mortal danger. When Malvo was captured, investigators uncovered notebooks filled with militant rhetoric, drawings, and writings that echoed Muhammad's worldview. At first, Malvo seemed to embrace Muhammad's ideology, taking responsibility for multiple shootings. But as time passed, and as the legal system separated him from Muhammad's influence, Malvo's tone shifted significantly. The legal question facing the courts in 2003 and 2004 was not whether Malvo participated in the killings. His involvement was extensively documented through evidence, witness testimony, and his own statements. The question was how the justice system should treat a teenager who committed adult-level atrocities under the guidance of a manipulative older partner. In the Virginia trial for the murder of FBI analyst Linda Franklin, prosecutors initially sought the death penalty, arguing that Malvo's actions were intentional, premeditated, and consistent with a terrorist operation. Defense attorneys countered with a powerful argument. Malvo had been psychologically conditioned and controlled by Muhammad, trapped in a dynamic where obedience became survival. They presented evidence of emotional manipulation, isolation tactics, and the twisted father-son dynamic that shaped the teen's worldview. The jury ultimately rejected the death penalty, concluding that Malvo's age and vulnerability, combined with Muhammad's dominant influence, made execution an excessive response. Malvo was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. But because the sniper attacks crossed multiple jurisdictions, the legal process didn't end there. In October 2004, Malvo accepted a plea agreement in Spotsylvania County, receiving another life sentence without parole in exchange for sparing the victims' families the trauma of repeated trials. The courtroom atmosphere during these proceedings reflected the tension between horror at the crimes committed and recognition that Malvo had been, in many ways, a weapon shaped by Muhammad. Victims' families expressed grief and outrage, emphasizing the magnitude of the harm done and the sheer randomness that amplified the emotional devastation. Meanwhile, legal scholars and child psychologists debated the broader implications. Should a minor be condemned to spend the rest of his life behind bars, even if his crimes were orchestrated by an adult who exploited his instability? Malvo's case later played a significant role in national discussions about juvenile sentencing. Supreme Court decisions in the 2010s ruled that mandatory life without parole for juveniles is unconstitutional in many cases, requiring courts to consider youth and potential rehabilitation. Malvo's lawyers argued that these rulings should apply to him, while victims' families insisted that the severity and calculated nature of the sniper attacks warranted permanent incapacitation. Although some of Malvo's sentences became subject to reconsideration, the political and emotional weight of the case made any possibility of release extraordinarily difficult. Over time, Malvo publicly expressed deep remorse, describing his former self as a brainwashed teenager and acknowledging the irreversible harm caused. But remorse does not erase the impact of the crimes, and the public memory of the sniper attacks remains one of collective fear, national anxiety, and lives cut short without warning. The 2004 sentencing of Lee Boyd Malvo cemented his status as one of the youngest individuals in U.S. history to receive multiple life without parole sentences. His case serves as a haunting example of how a minor can be molded into a perpetrator of violence through ideological grooming and emotional manipulation, raising profound questions about responsibility, punishment, and the capacity for change. Yet for many, the legal outcome was straightforward. Regardless of age or influence, Malvo participated in acts that terrorized millions, shattered families, and left psychological scars that still linger in the D.C. region. The sentencing ensured that the young man who once looked through the scope of a rifle at innocent strangers would never again have the chance to walk freely among them. 10. Bernard Ebbers. Bernard Ebbers' 2004 sentencing became one of the defining moments in the history of American corporate crime, a landmark event that exposed the catastrophic consequences of unchecked executive power and the massive ripple effects that financial fraud can have on employees, investors, and entire industries. Ebbers, the former CEO of WorldCom, had once been celebrated as a visionary leader in the telecommunications boom of the 1990s. Under his leadership, WorldCom grew from a small Mississippi long-distance company into the second-largest telecommunications provider in the United States, expanding aggressively through mergers and acquisitions at a rate few competitors could match. But behind the meteoric rise was a company whose internal financial reality had become increasingly unstable, and Ebbers' determination to sustain the illusion of explosive growth ultimately led to one of the largest accounting frauds in history. By the late 1990s, WorldCom began facing pressure from declining revenues, the bursting of the tech bubble, and rising competition. Instead of acknowledging the slowdown, Ebers allegedly demanded that his executives continue reporting strong earnings to keep the stock price inflated. Prosecutors later showed that Ebers tied a significant portion of his personal wealth to WorldCom's stock value, taking out massive personal loans secured by shares that were rapidly losing value. As the pressure mounted, internal accountants, directly or indirectly instructed by top leadership, began misclassifying billions of dollars in expenses as capital investments, artificially inflating profits and stabilizing the stock price on paper while the company itself was deteriorating. In 2002, the fraud finally surfaced when internal auditors discovered discrepancies that could no longer be concealed, uncovering what would eventually total more than $11 billion in fraudulent accounting entries. WorldCom collapsed almost overnight, filing for what was then the largest bankruptcy in U.S. history. The fallout was staggering. Tens of thousands of employees lost jobs or retirement savings, investors saw their portfolios destroyed, pension funds collapsed, and the broader telecommunications industry absorbed a shock that reverberated for years. Congressional hearings followed, with lawmakers demanding answers about how a fraud of this magnitude could go undetected for so long. Ebers, once hailed as a self-made billionaire and business icon, denied any wrongdoing and insisted he was unaware of the fraudulent accounting practices happening under his leadership. Prosecutors rejected this narrative, arguing that as CEO, Ebers set the tone of the company's culture and directly pressured subordinates to hit the numbers, creating an environment in which fraud became the only way to meet his unrealistic expectations. Witness after witness testified to Ebers' hands-on involvement, describing how he monitored performance metrics, pushed for favorable earnings reports, and stood to gain personally from the inflated stock price. Some executives, including CFO Scott Sullivan, pleaded guilty and cooperated with investigators, revealing how financial statements were systematically manipulated to appease Ebers and maintain his public image as a brilliant strategist steering an unstoppable corporate juggernaut. When the case reached sentencing in July 2005, following his March conviction by a federal jury, the courtroom atmosphere reflected both outrage and weary recognition from a public still recovering from the Enron and Tyco scandals. But the groundwork for Ebers' downfall had already been laid in 2004, when prosecutors built the foundation of the charges and secured cooperation from key insiders. Victims gave testimony describing how the collapse had wiped out their retirement accounts, forced them out of homes, or left them scrambling to rebuild financial security after decades of loyalty to WorldCom. Their stories underscored that white-collar crime is not abstract. It destroys real lives with real consequences. The judge emphasized this point during sentencing, noting that the scale of the fraud had inflicted harm on millions of people and destabilized confidence in American markets. Ebers, who maintained that he had been betrayed by subordinates acting without his knowledge, received a 25-year prison sentence, effectively a life term for a man already in his 60s. It was one of the longest sentences ever handed down to a corporate executive at the time, and it sent a clear message. CEOs cannot claim ignorance when fraud occurs directly under their leadership, especially when they benefit personally from the deception. His sentence became a historic benchmark, reinforcing the notion that executive accountability must extend beyond public image and into the legal consequences of mismanagement and misconduct. Ebers began serving his sentence at a low-security federal facility, and as he aged, his health declined significantly. Over the years, debates continued about whether his punishment was too harsh or simply proportional to the magnitude of the damage he caused. Supporters of the sentence argued that without meaningful consequences, corporate fraud would remain an attractive risk for executives seeking to inflate stock prices and personal wealth. Critics argued that the system was scapegoating Ebers for broader corporate failures. Regardless of perspective, the broader impact was undeniable. The WorldCom scandal helped drive major reforms, including the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which imposed stricter financial reporting requirements, expanded oversight responsibilities for corporate boards, and increased penalties for executives who submit false financial statements. Ebers' downfall became a cautionary tale taught in business schools, discussed in legal seminars, and cited in policy debates for years to come. His release on compassionate grounds in early 2020, due to deteriorating health, marked a quiet end to a saga that had once dominated national headlines. Shortly after his release, he died, leaving behind a legacy defined not by business innovation, but by the largest accounting scandal of its time. Bernard Ebers' sentencing remains symbolic of a turning point in American corporate culture, a moment when accountability finally caught up with a CEO whose ambition, pressure, and denial contributed to a disaster that destroyed livelihoods and reshaped the regulatory landscape for an entire generation.